Captain Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the lunar station and watched the alien ship approach. It was massive and shaped like nothing humans had ever built. The vessel moved with slow, deliberate grace as if it owned the space around it. Jake had served in the Earth Defense Fleet for 15 years, but this was his first time seeing something not made by human hands. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face calm. The crew around him whispered nervously as the alien ship came to a stop, just beyond the station perimeter. The transmission came through on all channels at once. A deep voice spoke in perfect English, though something about the tone felt wrong. Too smooth and too measured, like a teacher speaking to children. The voice introduced itself as Vex Thor and representative of the Galactic Council. Jake listened as the alien explained that humanity had been discovered and that Earth would now follow Council regulations. There was no question in the voice and no room for discussion. It was a statement of fact delivered with absolute certainty. Commander Lisa Chen arrived at the station 3 hours later. She was Earth's chief diplomat and one of the smartest people Jake had ever met. She carried herself with quiet confidence as she prepared to meet the alien delegation. Jake accompanied her to the docking bay where the aliens would board. He noticed Lisa's hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. She knew something important was about to happen, and so did he. When Vex Thor entered the station, Jake had to force himself not to step back. The alien stood nearly 8 feet tall with a body covered in dark chitinous plates. 4 arms hung at its sides, and its head was angular with too many eyes. Behind Vex Thor came 6 more aliens, all armed with weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. The escort took positions around the bay, making it clear this was not a friendly visit. Lisa stepped forward and extended her hand in greeting. Vex Thor looked at the gesture for a long moment before ignoring it completely. The alien spoke, and its voice filled the bay without need for amplification. It explained that the Galactic Council had governed the known galaxy for over 10,000 years. 47 species followed Council law, and now humanity would become the 48th. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. Jake felt his stomach drop as Vex Thor listed the demands. All military vessels would be surrendered within 30 days. Human technology would be restricted to levels the Council deemed appropriate. Earth would pay tribute in rare metals and minerals. A Council overseer would be stationed on Earth to ensure compliance. Any resistance would be met with sanctions first and military force if necessary. Vex Thor delivered each point with the same flat certainty as if reading a grocery list. Lisa tried to negotiate. She spoke about human sovereignty and the right to self-determination. She suggested a partnership instead of submission. Her words were careful and diplomatic, but Jake could hear the steel underneath. Vex Thor listened without expression and then simply repeated the terms. There would be no negotiation because the Council did not negotiate. New species always followed this path, and humanity would be no different. The alien made it sound like a law of nature rather than a choice. Jake watched Lisa's face as she realized the truth. The Council didn't see humans as equals or even potential allies. They saw primitives who needed to be controlled. Vex Thor's contempt was barely hidden beneath the formal language. The alien looked at the human facilities with the same expression someone might give a child's treehouse. Interesting perhaps, but ultimately insignificant. The meeting ended with Vex Thor handing Lisa a data chip containing the full terms and conditions. The alien delegation returned to their ship without further comment. As the bay doors sealed behind them, Lisa stood very still for several seconds. Then she turned to Jake and said they needed to get back to Earth immediately. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were blazing. The emergency session convened 12 hours later in a secure facility beneath the North American Defense Command. President Helen Carter sat at the head of the table surrounded by military leaders and scientists and advisors. Jake stood along the wall with other senior officers and watched the debate unfold. The room was divided sharply between those who wanted to comply and those who wanted to fight. General Marcus Hayes spoke first. He was a career military man with more combat experience than anyone else in the room. He argued that surrendering their fleet meant surrendering any ability to defend themselves. The Council would control human technology and human expansion and human destiny. Once they gave up their weapons, they would never get them back. Marcus slammed his fist on the table and said that bowing to bullies only invited more bullying. Others disagreed. Secretary of State Peter Grant pointed out that Earth was one planet facing 47 species with thousands of years of advanced technology. Fighting was suicide. Better to comply for now and look for advantages later. Buy time to learn and grow stronger. Grant's voice was reasonable, but Jake could hear the fear underneath. The man was terrified of what the council might do if Earth refused. The argument went in circles for nearly an hour. Jake felt his frustration building. Both sides made valid points, but neither offered a real solution. Comply and lose everything slowly, or fight and lose everything quickly. Those seemed to be the only options on the table. Then Dr. Raymond Cole spoke up. He was a thin man with gray hair and tired eyes who ran Earth's Experimental Weapons Division. Most people didn't know what Cole's department actually did because most of their work was classified at the highest levels. Cole had been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, but now he cleared his throat and everyone turned to look at him. Cole said there might be a third option. He explained that his team had been working on several projects that pushed the boundaries of known physics. Some of those projects had yielded interesting results. Very interesting results. He suggested that perhaps the Council didn't know everything about human capabilities. Perhaps Earth had a few surprises that could change the equation. Cole spoke carefully and chose his words with precision. He never quite said what these projects were, but the implications hung in the air like electricity. President Carter leaned forward. She asked Cole directly if he was saying Earth could actually resist the Council. Could they fight and win? Cole met her gaze and said that winning was a complicated word, but making the cost of attacking Earth too high to be worth it. That was possible. Maybe even likely. The room fell silent. Jake felt something shift in the atmosphere. A decision was being made without words. He saw it in Carter's face and in Marcus Hayes' sudden attention and in Lisa Chen's slight nod. Earth wasn't going to roll over and submit. They were going to take the third option and gamble everything on human ingenuity and stubborn pride. Carter asked how long Cole needed to prepare. The scientist said his people could be ready in 3 weeks. The president looked around the room at each person individually. Then she made her decision. Earth would use the full 30 days and deliver their response in a way the Council would never forget. She tasked Jake with a special assignment and told him to report to Cole's facility immediately. As Jake left the room, he felt equal parts fear and excitement. Humanity was about to tell the oldest power in the galaxy to go to hell. The next month would determine whether that was courage or suicide. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and testing. Jake Morrison spent every waking hour at Dr. Cole's facility deep beneath the surface of Mars. The place was a maze of laboratories and testing, chambers where scientists worked on projects that would have seemed like magic a generation ago. Cole showed Jake the upgrades being installed on the Valiant and explained each system with barely contained excitement. The ship looked the same from the outside, but everything inside had been rebuilt. New engines that bent space in ways that shouldn't be possible. Weapons that used energy more efficiently than anything the Council had ever seen. Defensive systems that didn't stop attacks but redirected them into empty space. Cole called it applied physics, but Jake thought it looked more like controlled chaos. The day before the deadline, Jake took the Valiant out for final testing. His crew was small and hand-picked. Each member had volunteered knowing they might not come back. Lieutenant Gary Price handled navigation with steady hands despite the tension on his face. Ensign Beth Holland managed weapon systems and checked every connection 3 times. Commander Kevin Wright coordinated communications and watched the sensor displays with intense focus. They ran through every system twice and then twice more. Everything worked perfectly, but Jake still felt nervous energy crawling up his spine. President Carter gave him his final orders in a private transmission. Jake would jump the Valiant directly into Council space and deliver humanity's response in person. No diplomats and no intermediaries. Just one ship appearing where it should be impossible to go. And one message delivered with absolute clarity. Carter's face was calm on the screen, but Jake could see the weight she carried. She was gambling the future of Earth on this moment. If Jake failed, there would be no second chances. Day 29 arrived and Jake gave the order. The Valiant's new engines powered up and space itself seemed to ripple around the ship. Gary fed coordinates into the navigation system and hit execute. The universe twisted and suddenly they were somewhere else entirely. The transition was smoother than any jump Jake had experienced. One moment they were in deep space beyond Mars and the next they were hovering directly above the Council's capital world. Dozens of defense platforms surrounded them and hundreds of sensors locked onto their position. Warning sirens blared across every Council frequency. Jake opened a channel and broadcast on all bands. His voice was steady as he identified himself and his ship. He said he was there to deliver Earth's response to the Council's demands. Within seconds, the communication board lit up with incoming transmissions, threats and demands and questions all at once. Jake ignored them all and waited. He knew exactly who he needed to talk to. Vexthor's voice came through angry and sharp. The alien demanded to know how a human vessel had penetrated Council space. Jake smiled and said that was humanity's first answer. Earth had capabilities the Council didn't know about. Then he delivered the second answer. Humanity declined the Council's terms. Earth would govern itself and make its own decisions and chart its own course among the stars. There would be no surrender and no compliance. Vexthor could take that message back to his superiors. The channel went silent for a moment. Then a new voice spoke. It was deeper and older and carried weight that made Jake's instincts scream danger. Supreme Arbiter Quelix introduced himself as the leader of the Galactic Council. His tone was almost amused as he told Jake that defiance was pointless. The human ship was surrounded and outgunned. Quelix would allow Jake and his crew to live if they surrendered immediately. He called it mercy and made it sound like a generous offer. Jake looked at his crew. Gary nodded. Beth's hands moved across her console. Kevin gave a thumbs up. They were ready. Jake took a breath and responded to Quelix. He thanked the Arbiter for his concern, but humanity had a different plan. Then he gave the order that would change everything. Light them up. The Valiant's weapons came alive. Directed energy beams lanced out in 12 different directions simultaneously. Each beam found a Council cruiser, and each beam cut through shields like they weren't there. The alien ships tried to respond, but their systems went dark before they could fire. Beth wasn't destroying them. She was disabling them with surgical precision. Power plants shut down. Weapons went offline. Navigation computers crashed. Within 2 minutes, 6 cruisers were floating dead in space. The remaining 6 ships attempted to maneuver into attack position. They were fast, but the Valiant was faster. Gary sent the ship dancing between incoming fire that never quite connected. Kevin launched electronic warfare packages that turned the Council's own targeting systems against them. The alien ships started firing on each other in confusion. More warnings and more sirens and more chaos across every frequency. Beth fired again and 3 more cruisers went dark. Then another 2. Then the last one. 4 minutes after the engagement started, it was over. 12 Council cruisers floated powerless around the Valiant. Not destroyed and not damaged beyond repair. Just completely shut down with their crews alive but helpless. Jake opened the channel again and his voice cut through the confused chatter. He explained that the Valiant could have destroyed every ship but chose not to. Humanity didn't want war. They wanted respect. The Council had demanded submission and Earth was offering a counteroffer. Leave us alone and we'll leave you alone. Simple and clean and non-negotiable. Jake didn't wait for a response. He gave Gary the signal and the Valiant jumped away. Space twisted again and they were gone. Behind them, the Council capital erupted into chaos. Defense platforms that should have tracked the human ship showed nothing. Sensors that should have detected the jump signature recorded only empty space. The Valiant had appeared impossible and disappeared impossible, and left 12 disabled warships as proof that humanity was not what the Council thought. The crew stayed silent during the jump back to Earth. The weight of what they had done settled over them slowly. Beth stared at her console. Gary kept checking navigation even though they were already home. Kevin monitored for pursuit that never came. Jake sat in his command chair and wondered if he had just saved humanity or doomed it. President Carter was waiting when they docked at the lunar station. She came aboard personally and shook hands with every crew member. Then she pulled Jake aside and asked him how it felt. Jake thought about his answer carefully. He said it felt like lighting a match in a dark room full of gasoline. Now everyone could see clearly, but there was also a very real chance everything would burn. Carter nodded and said that was exactly right. But at least now Earth would burn on its own terms if it came to that. The Council's response came 6 hours later. It was terse and formal and promised consequences. Quelix declared that the attack on Council vessels was an act of war. The human species would be classified as hostile and dealt with accordingly. Economic sanctions would begin immediately. Military action would follow if Earth did not surrender within 1 standard galactic week. The message ended with a statement that the Council had maintained order for 10,000 years and would not allow one primitive species to disrupt that order. Jake read the message and felt strangely calm. The die was cast. There was no going back now. Earth had defied the most powerful authority in the galaxy, and made that defiance stick. The council couldn't ignore it and couldn't brush it aside. They would have to respond with force or lose face in front of every species they governed. Jake knew what was coming. War was inevitable now. Dr. Cole seemed almost pleased when he heard the news. He told Jake that the council's response was actually better than expected. They were angry, which meant they were scared. The fact that Quelix had given Earth a week instead of attacking immediately meant the Arbiter was uncertain. The old alien was probably scrambling to figure out how humans had technology that shouldn't exist. That uncertainty was Earth's greatest weapon right now. Let them wonder. Let them doubt. Let them make mistakes. General Marcus Hayes called a strategy meeting that night. Every senior officer in the Earth Defense Fleet attended, along with key scientists and government officials. Marcus stood at the front of the room and laid out the situation without sugarcoating it. Earth had picked a fight with an empire that controlled most of the known galaxy. The Council had resources and experience and numbers that humanity couldn't match. But humans also had advantages. They were defending their home. They had technology the Council didn't understand. Most importantly, they were unified in a way the Council probably wasn't. Marcus said the coming fight would be difficult, but not impossible. Earth had survived worse odds before. Jake listened and felt his resolve harden. He thought about his parents back on Earth and his sister, who worked at the Europa colony, and all the billions of humans who just wanted to live their lives in peace. The Council would have taken all of that away slowly and bureaucratically until nothing recognizably human remained. Better to fight and lose than surrender and fade. At least this way humanity would go down swinging. The week passed in frantic preparation. Every ship in the Earth Defense Fleet received upgrades based on the Valiant's systems. Defense platforms were installed throughout the solar system. Colonies on Mars and Europa and the outer moons were fortified. Supreme Arbiter Quelix stared at the reports on his display and refused to believe what he was reading. A single human vessel had penetrated the most secure system in Council space and disabled 12 warships in minutes. It was impossible, yet it had happened. The Arbiter's pride burned hot in his chest, but beneath that was something he hadn't felt in centuries. Uncertainty. He called for his best scientific minds and military strategists. Someone would explain this and someone would find a solution. The investigation team assembled within 2 days. Leading them was Isith, a reptilian scientist known throughout the Council for her methodical approach and ruthless honesty. She had served the Council for 40 years and solved problems that had stumped others. Isith looked at the data from the disabled cruisers and immediately knew this would be her most difficult assignment. The human weapons didn't follow known physics. The human ship had moved in ways that violated every principle of space travel. Either humans had discovered something revolutionary, or the Council's understanding of the universe was incomplete. Isith started with Earth's history. She accessed every record the Council had gathered during their initial survey of the human homeworld. What she found disturbed her more than the impossible technology. Humans were supposed to be a developing species barely beginning to explore their own star system. Instead, Isith discovered a civilization that had weaponized everything they touched. She read about something called World War II, where humans had killed each other by the millions using industrialized warfare. She learned about nuclear weapons developed and used before humans had even left their planet. She studied their Cold War, where 2 human factions had pointed world-ending weapons at each other for decades, and somehow avoided extinction. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Humans didn't develop technology for peace and then adapt it for war. They developed technology for war and then found peaceful uses afterward. Their computers had been built to calculate artillery trajectories and break enemy codes. Their rockets had been designed to carry weapons across continents before they carried explorers to the moon. Their internet had started as a military communication system. Every advancement seemed to come from conflict or competition, or the threat of destruction. Isith presented her initial findings to Quelix. The Arbiter listened with growing irritation as she explained that humanity was fundamentally different from every other species in the Council. Most civilizations reached space through gradual, peaceful development. They solved problems through cooperation and slowly built the technology needed for interstellar travel. Humans had clawed their way into space through competition and conflict. They had split atoms for weapons before using them for power. They had reached their moon not primarily for exploration, but as part of a political competition between rival factions. Quelix dismissed her concerns. He said conflict was common among primitive species. They all grew out of it eventually. Isith shook her head and explained that humans hadn't grown out of anything. They had simply redirected their competitive nature. Their corporations competed as fiercely as their nations once did. Their scientists raced each other to discoveries. Their entire civilization was structured around challenge and response. Remove external threats and humans created internal competition. They seemed incapable of stagnation. The military analysis came back equally troubling. Council strategists had examined the Valiant's attack patterns and weapon signatures. The consensus was that human technology wasn't more powerful than Council equivalents. It was more efficient. Human weapons used less energy to achieve better results. Human shields didn't resist force but redirected it. Human sensors didn't scan harder but scanned smarter. Every system showed the same pattern of doing more with less. It was the approach of a species that had learned to innovate under resource constraints. Isith dug deeper into human military history. She found records of something called mutually assured destruction. The concept made her physically ill. Humans had built enough nuclear weapons to render their entire planet uninhabitable, multiple times over. Then they had pointed these weapons at each other and maintained this balance of terror for generations. Children had grown up knowing that their world could end at any moment. Yet human civilization hadn't collapsed. It had thrived. They had developed art and science and culture while living under the constant threat of extinction. She presented this finding to the investigation team. The other scientists struggled to comprehend it. Most species that developed such weapons either destroyed themselves or immediately worked to eliminate them. Humans had kept them and learned to live with existential dread as a permanent condition. Isith suggested this might explain their psychological resilience. A species that could function while facing potential annihilation would not be easily intimidated by external threats. Meanwhile, on the council borders, a young officer named Prex noticed something strange. His job was monitoring deep space for unusual activity, standard work that usually involved watching automated systems track asteroid movements and catalog stellar phenomena. But over the past week, Prex had detected multiple human vessels in areas far from Earth. They weren't military ships. They were civilian craft conducting surveys and resource assessments. Some were already establishing small outposts on unclaimed worlds. Prex reported this to his superiors. The humans weren't preparing for war. They were ignoring the council entirely and expanding anyway. While Quelix assembled his armada and made threats, humanity was simply going about its business as if the council didn't exist. The arrogance was staggering but also strategically sound. Every day that passed without conflict was another day humans established themselves in new locations. They were creating facts on the ground that would be harder to undo later. Isith added this information to her growing report. She began to see a pattern in human behavior that explained everything. Humans didn't think in terms of single battles or short-term victories. They thought generationally. Their history showed countless examples of losing initial conflicts, but winning eventual wars through persistence and adaptation. They had a saying that Isith found particularly revealing: fall down 7 times and stand up 8. It spoke to a cultural acceptance of failure as a learning opportunity, rather than a final defeat. The technology analysis finally came back from the Council's best engineers. They had spent weeks examining every piece of data from the Valiant encounter. Their conclusion was both simple and devastating. Human technology worked because it was built on different fundamental assumptions. Council science had developed along certain lines that emphasized stability and predictability. Human science seemed to embrace chaos and uncertainty. They built systems that shouldn't work in theory but did work in practice. It was engineering by trial and error raised to an art form. One engineer noted something particularly interesting. Human weapons showed signs of rapid iteration. The technology was new and still being refined. That meant Earth's current capabilities were not their maximum capabilities. They were still developing and still improving. Any delay in confronting them would only make them stronger. The engineer recommended immediate overwhelming force before humans had time to advance further. Isith disagreed strongly. She argued that attacking humanity would be the worst possible decision. Her reasoning was based on everything she had learned about human psychology and history. Humans responded to threats by innovating faster. They turned challenges into motivation. Every conflict in their history had accelerated their technological development. The world wars had compressed a century of advancement into a few years. Their space race had achieved in a decade what should have taken generations. Attacking them wouldn't break them. It would be a catalyst that pushed them to develop even more dangerous capabilities. Quelix read Isith's full report and found himself caught between pride and pragmatism. His pride demanded that he punish human defiance. No species had ever challenged Council authority so directly. Allowing it to stand would encourage others to question Council rule. But pragmatism whispered that perhaps Isith was right. Perhaps humans were genuinely different, and perhaps the standard approach wouldn't work. The Arbiter called a meeting of the Council's ruling body. Representatives from all 47 member species gathered in the Great Chamber. Quelix presented the situation and asked for input. The responses varied wildly. Some species demanded immediate military action. Others suggested diplomatic solutions. A few quietly wondered if perhaps the Council's authority had grown too rigid over the millennia. The debate lasted for days. Arguments were made and countered and made again. Some representatives pointed out that allowing human defiance would undermine everything the Council stood for. Others noted that the Council stood for order and prosperity, not for pride and dominance. The chamber divided along lines that had been invisible for thousands of years. Old alliances strained and new factions formed. Through it all, Quelix remained silent. He was beginning to see something that disturbed him deeply. The Council wasn't as unified as he had believed. Many species complied not out of respect but out of fear or convenience. The Council armada assembled at the border of known space. 347 warships from 12 different species formed the largest military fleet in modern galactic history. Supreme Arbiter Quelix commanded from his flagship at the center of the formation. Around him floated vessels of every size and design, heavy cruisers with weapons that could shatter moons, fast destroyers built for precision strikes, carrier ships loaded with fighter craft, support vessels carrying enough supplies for a long campaign. The combined firepower could reduce a planet to molten slag in hours. Quelix looked at his fleet and felt certain of victory. The jump to Sol system was coordinated down to the millisecond. Every ship arrived simultaneously in a display meant to overwhelm and terrify. The formation spread across space like a metal wall. Quelix opened communications and broadcast his final ultimatum. Humanity had 1 hour to surrender unconditionally or face complete destruction. He expected panic and desperate pleas. Instead, he got Admiral Karen Wells. She appeared on his screen calm and composed. Her uniform was crisp and her expression showed no fear. Karen spoke in a clear voice that carried across every channel. She thanked Quelix for coming to Earth's home system. Then she said it was a big mistake. The Arbiter felt a flash of anger at her tone. This human spoke to him as an equal, when she commanded barely 40 ships against his hundreds. He told her that defiance would only make the destruction more complete. Karen smiled slightly and said they would see about that. The Defiant led Earth's defense fleet. Jake Morrison stood at the tactical station while Karen commanded from the captain's chair. Around them were 39 other human vessels arrayed in a loose defensive formation. They looked tiny compared to the Council armada. Gary Price monitored navigation and called out enemy ship movements. Beth Holland had weapons ready but held fire waiting for orders. Kevin Wright coordinated with the automated defense network scattered throughout the system. The bridge crew worked with practiced efficiency, but Jake could see the tension in their faces. They were outnumbered 8-1 and everyone knew it. Karen gave the order and Earth's fleet moved forward. The human ships accelerated to speeds that caught the Council by surprise. They weren't retreating or trying to negotiate. They were attacking. Quelix almost laughed at the absurdity. Then the first human weapons fired and 3 Council cruisers exploded, not disabled like during the Valiant incident. Destroyed completely. The Arbiter's laughter died in his throat. The battle erupted across the Sol system. Human ships darted between Council vessels, moving with impossible agility. Their weapons struck with devastating accuracy. Every shot counted and every shot hit something vital. But numbers began to tell. For every Council ship destroyed, 2 more moved into position. Human vessels started taking damage. The EDS Ranger took a direct hit and exploded in a ball of plasma. The EDS Guardian lost main power and drifted helpless. 3 more human ships were crippled in quick succession. Then the hidden defenses activated. Thousands of automated platforms emerged from asteroids and lunar craters. They had been waiting silent and cold for exactly this moment. The platforms opened fire in perfect coordination. Missiles streaked across space. Energy beams lanced out from unexpected angles. Council ships found themselves under attack from directions they hadn't anticipated. Quelix ordered his fleet to spread out and deal with the automated defenses, but doing so broke their formation. Human ships pressed their advantage. Karen directed the fleet with precision that spoke of years of tactical study. She targeted weak points and exploited gaps. The Defiant took heavy fire but kept moving. Jake watched the damage reports pile up and knew they couldn't sustain this much longer. 5 more human ships were destroyed. The defense platforms were being systematically eliminated. Earth's fleet was fighting brilliantly, but they were losing. Quelix saw victory approaching. His fleet had taken losses, but nothing that would change the outcome. The humans were brave and their technology was impressive. But courage and innovation couldn't overcome such overwhelming numbers. The Arbiter prepared his victory speech. Then Dr. Raymond Cole activated Project Longshot. On Mars, deep beneath the surface, a facility that officially didn't exist powered up. Similar facilities on Europa and Titan and a dozen hidden locations throughout the system came online simultaneously. They were gravity manipulators, devices that could create localized distortions in space-time itself. Cole had been working on them for 5 years. The theory was sound, but the practical applications had been limited. Until now. Cole had figured out how to link them into a network. He had turned the entire Sol system into the galaxy's largest trap. The effect was instantaneous. Council ships suddenly found themselves unable to move. Their engines roared at full power but achieved nothing. Space around them had been twisted into artificial gravity wells. Every vessel was locked in position as firmly as if they had been welded to the stars themselves. Weapons still functioned, but without the ability to maneuver, they couldn't aim properly. Quelix felt his ship strain against invisible bonds and realized with horror what had happened. The humans had changed the rules of engagement. Karen's voice came over all channels. Her tone was still calm but now carried an edge of steel. She gave the Council fleet a simple choice: surrender immediately or stay trapped until life support failed. There would be no negotiation and no second chances. The human fleet held all the advantages now. They could fire at will while the Council ships could only sit and take it. Karen gave them 10 minutes to decide. Chaos erupted across the Council command network. Ship captains demanded orders. Crews questioned why they were dying for Council pride. Quelix tried to restore order, but his authority was crumbling. Some ships began signaling their willingness to surrender. Others refused and demanded they fight to the last. The unity that had carried the Armada into battle shattered under pressure. Then a new transmission cut through the confusion. President Helen Carter appeared on every screen in every ship simultaneously. The broadcast bypassed command channels and went directly to individual crew members. Carter spoke in multiple languages using translation protocols Earth had stolen from captured Council databases. Her message was simple and devastating. This isn't your fight. Your leaders demanded we submit to their authority. We refused because authority doesn't grant the right to dominate. They brought you here to die for their pride. We're giving you a choice your leaders won't. Convince your commanders to stand down or convince them yourself. You have 1 hour. The effect was electric. Throughout the Council, fleet crews began talking among themselves. Some had never questioned orders before. Others had private doubts they had never voiced. Carter's words gave them permission to think for themselves. She had framed the conflict not as humanity versus the Council, but as freedom versus tyranny. And she had done it by speaking directly to the people who would have to do the dying. Quelix watched his fleet begin to fracture. Ship after ship reported crew unrest. Some captains maintained control through force. Others found themselves facing mutiny. The Arbiter tried to rally his forces, but the damage was done. Carter had planted a seed of doubt that was spreading like wildfire. For the first time in recorded history, Council military crews were refusing orders en masse. On the Defiant, Karen watched the chaos unfold with satisfaction. Jake stood beside her and quietly asked if she thought it would work. Karen said it was already working. They didn't need every Council ship to mutiny. They just needed enough to make continuing the battle impossible. Quelix could either retreat and preserve what unity remained or push forward and risk losing his entire fleet to internal rebellion. The hour ticked down slowly. 63 Council ships formally surrendered. Their crews had overpowered their officers and signaled their intent to stand down. Another 100 ships reported discipline problems. Quelix sat on his bridge and felt the weight of 10,000 years of Council authority crumbling around him. He had come to break human defiance. Instead, the humans had broken something far more fundamental: They had broken the assumption that the Council's word was law. Finally, with only minutes remaining, Quelix gave the order to retreat. The withdrawal was messy and humiliating. Ships that could be released from the gravity wells jumped away immediately. Others had to wait for human technicians to free them. The mutinous vessels stayed behind and requested asylum. Earth granted it without hesitation. Karen told them they would be welcome as long as they respected human sovereignty. The battle was over. Earth had lost 8 ships and had 5 more badly damaged. Hundreds of defense platforms were destroyed. But the Council Armada had fled. Quelix retreated with his authority shattered and his fleet fractured. The news spread across the galaxy at light speed. Humanity had stood alone against the Council's might and won not through superior force but through superior strategy and psychology. Jake watched the last Council ships jump away and felt something strange. Not triumph exactly, more like relief mixed with exhaustion. Beth sat at her station with tears running down her face. Gary was laughing quietly to himself. Kevin just stared at his screens in disbelief. They had survived. More than that, they had won. The weeks following the battle brought chaos to the Galactic Council. News of the defeat spread through every inhabited system. Species that had obeyed Council authority for generations began asking questions they had never dared voice before. If humanity could defy the Council and survive, then what did that mean for everyone else? The carefully maintained order that Quelix had taken for granted started to crack. The 63 ships that had mutinied became a symbol. Their crews had chosen conscience over orders and paid no price for it. Earth welcomed them and treated them with respect. Other Council military members watched and wondered if they too could make different choices. Some species that had been forcibly integrated into the Council centuries ago started talking openly about independence. Border worlds questioned why they paid tribute. The foundation of Council power, which had always been unquestioned compliance, began to crumble. Supreme Arbiter Quelix tried to maintain control. He gave speeches about the importance of unity and order. He promised reforms and greater representation. But his words rang hollow after the humiliation at Earth. The other Council species heard his promises and remembered 10,000 years of being told what to do. Some wanted to preserve the old system. Others saw an opportunity for change. The Council chamber became a place of heated debate instead of calm governance. Jake Morrison led a human delegation back to Council space 3 months after the battle. This time he came by invitation rather than intrusion. The message had been formal and careful. The Council requested Earth's presence to discuss terms of coexistence. Not surrender or compliance, coexistence. That single word represented a revolution in how the Council saw humanity. Jake brought Admiral Karen Wells and President Carter's chief advisor, along with a security detail. They jumped into Council space using the same stealth technology that had shocked everyone before. The Defiant appeared exactly where it was supposed to be and docked without incident. The reception was strange. Some Council representatives treated the humans with open hostility. Others showed curiosity or even respect. A few younger species representatives approached Jake privately to ask questions about Earth's defense. They wanted to know how humanity had resisted. More importantly, they wanted to know if their own species could do the same. Jake answered carefully. He said courage mattered more than technology. That standing together mattered more than standing alone. That freedom had to be claimed, not given. The formal negotiations took place in the Great Chamber. Quelix presided, but his authority was clearly diminished. Jake presented Earth's proposal. Humanity wanted a partnership between equals, not membership in a hierarchy. Earth would share knowledge and coordinate on mutual threats, but would maintain full sovereignty. Other species would be free to join this new framework or stay with the Council. The choice would be theirs. Jake called it the Galactic Assembly, a coalition based on voluntary cooperation rather than enforced compliance. The reaction was mixed. Traditional Council species saw it as an insult. How could humans who had been known for less than a year propose to restructure galactic governance? But others saw possibility. Isith spoke in favor of the human proposal. She argued that the Council had stagnated precisely because it eliminated competition and challenge. Without pressure to innovate, civilizations grew comfortable and stopped advancing. The assembly model would allow diversity and experimentation. Different species could try different approaches and learn from each other. The debate lasted for weeks. Representatives gave passionate speeches for and against. Some argued that abandoning the council system would lead to chaos and conflict. Others pointed out that the current system had bred resentment that was already causing conflict. Jake sat through the sessions and watched galactic politics unfold. It reminded him of Earth's own history, the same arguments and the same fears and the same hopes, different species but the same fundamental questions about power and freedom. Outside the chamber, the galaxy was changing whether the council approved or not. Human colony ships pushed deeper into unexplored space. They found empty worlds and started building settlements. Other species watched, and some began following the human example. Exploration that had slowed to nearly nothing under council restrictions suddenly accelerated. It was as if humanity's defiance had given everyone permission to dream bigger. The final vote came on a cold morning by Galactic Standard Time. The question was simple: dissolve the council as it currently existed and form a new galactic assembly based on voluntary participation, or maintain the old structure and try to enforce compliance. The chamber fell silent as the votes were recorded. Species that had never disagreed with council policy suddenly voted for change. Others who had complained privately voted to maintain tradition. The result was closer than anyone expected. The assembly proposal passed by just 12 votes. Quelix accepted the decision with dignity that surprised Jake. The old arbiter stood and formally dissolved the council that he had led for so long. He said that perhaps it was time for new voices and new ideas, that the galaxy was large enough for many approaches to governance. Some in the chamber wept, others cheered. Quelix stepped down from his position and walked out of the chamber for the last time. His era had ended and a new one was beginning. Not every species joined the Galactic Assembly. About a third chose to retreat into isolation rather than participate in the new system. They closed their borders and refused contact. Some were bitter about losing their privileged status. Others were simply afraid of change. Jake understood. Freedom was frightening when you had spent generations being told what to do. He hoped they would eventually come around, but knew it might take time. The species that did join worked together to establish the assembly's structure. Representatives from 29 different civilizations, including humanity, gathered to write the founding principles. Equal representation for all members. Decisions made by consensus when possible and by majority vote when necessary. No species would have veto power over others. Military cooperation would be voluntary, and for mutual defense only. Technology would be shared freely among members. Disputes would be resolved through mediation, not force. Earth became the Assembly's headquarters almost by accident. President Carter offered the lunar station as a neutral meeting place, and everyone agreed. The symbolism was powerful. The species that had defied the council now hosted the organization that replaced it. Jake watched the first official assembly session with pride and some amusement. The chamber was much smaller than the old council hall and much louder. Representatives argued and debated and sometimes shouted. It was messy and chaotic and absolutely democratic. Admiral Karen Wells took command of the Assembly's Coordinated Defense Initiative. She worked with military officers from a dozen species to develop protocols for mutual protection. The force they built wasn't an army of conquest. It was a true defensive alliance where each species contributed what they could and retained control of their own forces. Karen said it reminded her of old Earth alliances. Imperfect and sometimes frustrating, but based on choice rather than compulsion. Back on Earth, celebrations continued for months. Humanity had secured its independence and helped reshape galactic civilization in the process. But not everyone was celebrating. Jake visited a memorial built for those who had died defending Earth. 8 ships lost in the battle. Over 2,000 people who would never go home. He stood before the memorial wall and read names. These people had given everything so humanity could be free. Their sacrifice deserved to be remembered. President Carter gave a speech at the memorial dedication. She spoke about the cost of freedom and the responsibility it carried. Earth had proven that even the small could stand against the powerful. But that victory meant nothing if humanity became what they had fought against. Carter said Earth would never demand submission from others, would never force their way of life on anyone, would treat every species with the respect they deserved. The galaxy was watching to see if humanity would live up to those ideals. Jake stood on the Defiance Bridge 6 months after the Assembly's formation. His ship was on patrol near the border of human space. The job was routine and boring, which was exactly what Jake wanted after so much excitement. Gary plotted courses between survey points. Beth ran diagnostic checks on weapons they hopefully wouldn't need. Kevin monitored communications and reported nothing unusual. The crew had settled into comfortable routine. Then Kevin reported something strange. A distress call from a civilian freighter, not a human ship. One of the species that had chosen isolation after the council dissolved. The ship had suffered engine failure and was drifting. Jake ordered the Defiant to intercept. Gary questioned whether they should help a species that had rejected the assembly. Jake said they helped because it was right, not because of politics. They reached the freighter and found it badly damaged. Jake authorized a rescue operation. Human engineers transferred to the alien ship and worked alongside its crew to repair the engines. The aliens were suspicious at first, but gradually relaxed as they realized the humans expected nothing in return. After 6 hours, the repairs were complete.